All right, so yeah, let's get started, and welcome to a guided tour to 80s retro gaming. We're going to be talking about 80s computer games and playing them now in 2020. I guess before we get started talking about the topic at hand of 80s computer games, we can introduce our tour guides for the next hour, our lovely panelists, and let us know what 80s home computers you grew up with and what's your relationship to these systems that we're talking about. Jesse, would you like to start?
Sure. So I'm an adjunct at the Game Center, and I teach a class on American computer games of the 80s. Is the class that's probably most relevant here, along with some tabletop and info classes. And I mean, the relevance to me is very straightforward. I grew up with these. I grew up in essentially middle-class household, so we never had the cutting-edge thing. But as soon as Commodore crushed some other computer, I would get it in a fire sale. And so I had a TI 99 and an Atari 800. And my dad had the only PC clone that was actually slower than IBM PC. So had experience with an end of this stuff and then. Just kept up an interest as I got older through the 90s and so
on. Bennett, how about yourself?
Yeah, so like all my colleagues here, I teach classes at the NYU Game Center, and I guess I have taught a class on Retrogaming with Clara, focusing on European games. It's sort of a lifelong interest of mine, playing games from all different systems. But the ones that I grew up with, I guess through the 80s, through the mid 80s. The ZX Spectrum, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, a British 8-bit computer. And then come the end of the 80s, maybe 88, 89, our family got a Commodore Amiga, 16-bit computer. So those were the two things that I spent the most time on. But I was one of those kids who, whenever I saw any kind of computer, even if it was worse than the ones we had at home, I just kind of magnetized to it. So for me, it was a little bit of everything.
Clara, Ben had mentioned the class that you co-taught together.
Yes, so I'm also faculty at the NYU Game Center, and yes, Ben and I taught the one class, probably worldwide, on European games of the 80s, and that specifically. Of course, we'll be talking a bit about those. I grew up with the MSX platform. I had an MSX and then an MSX2. Those were the ones that we had at home, and the platform I'll be talking about. And then my uncle had the ZX Spectrum that he built from a kit. So those were the ones I had the most access to. Also in the neighborhood, whenever anybody bought a computer, they called my dad or me, even though I was very little, because we apparently knew how to read the manual. So yeah, I fiddled a bit with computers like the Amstrad CPC, for example. So, but yeah, my experience is mostly with the MSX.
And Naomi Clark, how about yourself?
Yeah, although I also teach classes at the NYU Game Center, I think I'm one of the few people here who has not taught a class on retro gaming. I think my expertise primarily comes, from my childhood. I remember getting our first family computer. I think in 1983. It was Apple IIe, and that was my computer growing up. Initially, we had it in our living room, and then eventually I kind of just dragged it into my bedroom since nobody else was using it. And I don't know, I learned how to program in BASIC on that thing. By the very end of the 80s, I think we also had one of the early generation Macs in the 80s and then into the 90s. I got my own Macintosh, Power Mac at the end of the 90s. But really all of the 80s, I was playing games on that Apple IIe. And fortunately, I had an aunt who was a software pirate. And when we got an Apple IIe, which she had convinced our family to buy, she sent me a giant shoebox full of floppy disks, about this many floppy disks. And so I spent literally years, just sort of going through the floppy disks and being like, okay, let me try this one. Let me see what's on this one. So it was just a constant series of mysteries unfolding. And I think we bought very little software, and it was pretty expensive if you want to have a big software library. So I was lucky that I got exposed to a lot of games that way.
And my name is Alexander King, and I also am an adjunct professor at the NYU Game Center. And I'm maybe 5 years too young to have grown up with some of these systems. But I had an original Macintosh, was my the computer that we had in our basement. But it was actually only later, as an adult, trying to find games that I played as a kid, that I realized that growing up in the UK, that a lot of the games that I played well into the 90s were on Amigas. or the Acorn Archimedes, I realized was like, oh, that was like the computer that both of the schools, that, you know, that's what were in the computer labs, and that's where all those games came from. So yeah, so most of these computer systems I kind of came to later in life to find, and that's who we're talking to, right? Is assuming people are not familiar with these sort of systems. I guess before jumping into that, it's kind of coincidence that we all teach at the NYU Game Center. It's like it's not a Game Center panel. It just like, that's just how I know you all, and we know each other. But it's also not a coincidence in that, I guess, like as you mentioned, there are classes at the Game Center that they're about that. So I guess for people who teach, you know, game designers, teach future game designers, is there something about older games that are worth looking at in particular old computer games that you found in any of your teaching practices?
I think for me, the most useful thing is just that a lot of old computer games, even ones that were extremely popular back in the 80s or 90s, have kind of been on evolutionary branches of game design that died away. You know, that were extremely popular in the day, and then perhaps something from the arcade or from the consoles became more of the sort of standard design. And so there's a lot of ideas back there that are kind of interesting and successful in their own context, but have been forgotten. So, you know, just like if you're writing a pop song, you might go and listen to some jazz records from the 60s for ideas that have been forgotten, get something, kind of freshen it up. There's a lot of inspiration to be found in those particular games. And I think also because they tended to be made by smaller companies or individuals, there's a lot more idiosyncratic games, games with really kind of strange or kind of, from our point of view, unexpected aspects. So for me, that's the entire appeal.
Yeah, and if I can piggyback on that a bit, this part of it where like there were no bounds to imagination, that were the conventions were being invented back then. So that's one of the fun things to see. Games about, going to see penguins. We're going to see, I don't know if we have any about lawnmowers, but there are games about lawnmowers, for example, miners, things like those.
Yeah, I think a lot of parallels can be found between our game design students and these older games because they're both operating under constraints. And there's not a lot of if there's a generation gap or if there's anything they kind of have to cast and come over, I think it's much less the games themselves, which can be janky or a little cryptic or obtuse, but they play test their friends' games. Like, this is not new to them. But I think the games themselves, certainly dabbling in them. And when I teach that American Computer Games of the 80s class, I try to show people like a dozen games a week, and just if they can find one that they kind of click with and want to go deep on, that to me is a success, right?
So yeah, so I think that's a good sort of transition point to talking about what exactly we're talking about. And since I think I've actually been really impressed the last couple of years, the way that like retro gaming has kind of spread to a wider kind of games culture, and that but computer games are still a little obscure. I think in part because we're used to the idea that there are different consoles, and then as now there were different consoles. But this idea that there are all of these different computer systems, none of which exist today, is I think the kind of harder thing. And one of the impetus for this talk was like the way that people kind of like back project DOS and Windows into the 80s and like refer to old PC games and stuff, when in fact like the Wintel, IBM PC, DOS, that architecture was like one of the worst platforms for games in actual 80s. It's not until the 90s and stuff that those get better. But as a result, I think makes people kind of unaware of them today. So that's kind of the period that we're talking about in these systems. And there is something about the fact that the thing that is playing the game is also the tool that makes it. I know in your book, Naomi, in a game design vocabulary, you talk about like these are a lot of the first games that have level editors and stuff. And playing is it Lode Runner is the
yeah, Lode Runner was what I did a lot of my first level design on. It's true, I think of a lot of 80s kids, and I think there was a sense, even back when I was a kid, of somehow being a little bit closer to the people that were making the game, right? So for me, that was this almost like zine-like thing that really ties in with what Jesse was talking about as a hobbyist market, right? That the people the creators are talking to are often they're fellow hobbyists. They may not be software developers in the same way, but they're kind of like part of the same crowd. And so when I was like barely a teenager by the end of this era, and I was only a member of this club because my friends and I figured out how to just copy games, right? It was just like with cassette tapes or anything else, right? Just we're making copies of stuff, being like, oh, check this thing out, right? And you get this mysterious floppy disk and you have no idea what's on it, and you have to see whether it'll run on your machine. And then when you do, you get like a weird letter from somewhere, right? From somewhere in California or in Europe or who knows where, that like somebody's made this thing. You have no idea how it's supposed to work, and often like without any kind of packaging or commercial apparatus surrounding it, right? Which is, I feel like, really light years from where we are today. Even with indie games, there was like almost no presentation in the way that I encountered these games, right? It's just like a black disc. No, it's not even a manual, like at least the way that I got them.
So for people in the present, going back and playing these games, you know, are there any specific or any kind of general tips that work for people, like stuff that people should be aware of as they're playing these games?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that you often have to read a manual, right? For a computer game, the presumption is that you're coming to it with an openness to do some work. It's not going to tutorialize you. It's not necessarily going to tell you all the buttons. There might be a strange procedure for loading it up that's different than every other game. You can still get those manuals. They're almost all captured and stored online somewhere, but often not with the actual game media. So it's not like a NES game you just pop in the ROM and they all have the same interface. Especially old 8-bit computer games all have their own keyboard layout. They have different support for controllers. It can really be different. You know, I think you need to come to it with a readiness to do a little bit more work to be able to kind of extract the goodness out of the games.
Yeah, and I think that's a great. There is this sort of like a barrier to entry to starting games that is not instantaneous, like with some console games. But it's usually like you know, it's not too bad. As we're enticing people, it is one of those things. Once you kind of get past the, you know, you've got to kind of orient yourself to it a little bit.
I think it can be pretty bad, but the right way to frame it in your mind is it's like an ancient Mayan tomb, and there's treasure inside, but there's also poison darts and like rolling rocks and you know, skeletons everywhere. And if you can figure out your way through that, you can get something that nobody else can get. So it's a way to have a kind of a boutique experience.
I have a special relationship to this because it took me literally years of my childhood to figure out how to play some Apple II games because I never had access to any manuals, right? I had to figure everything out by trial and error. It's like playing an experimental game these days, right? Where it's just like, you don't know what the buttons do. You just have to, you don't even know like what the goal of the game is or anything. But there's no substitution for an experience like that. And I would almost say, like, I would almost encourage people, like, at least with some games, like try to see if you can just figure it out from scratch, because it is enormously frustrating. And then when you figure it out, it's quite an unusual sensation. But I just had no alternative, and so I would get frustrated. I would stop. I would come back to a game maybe a week later to be like, can I figure that one out again? And so it's good that I had like a big stack of pirated games.
Yeah, like Naomi, all of our games were pirated because I'm from Australia, and Australia is one of the worst piracy countries in the world.
We're second.
Yeah,
Spain might be first.
Spain is up there as well, and you know, that meant that we often didn't have the manual, and so it really was like a process of just trying to extract the smallest little morsel of fun out of something that was this black box. I had the same experience.
I do think, I mean, I just wanted, because I guess I was the one person who did grow up with the manuals. I didn't have a lot of the games, but I basically did later when I had access to an Amiga through my stepfather at a lot of pirated games. I had kind of that same experience. But with the Atari 800, it was like, well, I would save up for a few months and I'd buy Ultima 4 or whatever. And that came in a huge box with a cloth map and a metal ankh and 3 different books that had like some sort of snakeskin kind of cover with runes on it. And like that was at least as much a part of the experience as what the zeros and ones. But yeah, I do think that Bennett, I think, sees it more as a burden. I see it more as like part of the pleasure. And there's certainly, I think, most of the games I listed are ones that aren't very manual oriented. They are more arcadey, pop in and play. But if you're interested in the RPGs or the adventure games, I would embrace it as being just as much a part of the game because it is. Right?
Yeah. The good news is that all of those materials pretty much have been scanned and put online. And the Internet Archive has like nearly everything, and you can just print out the manual and get a little bit of that flavor. You know, it definitely is worth doing. If you're going to play the strategy games and the RPGs, Jesse's saying, find the materials for sure.
Well, so as we, I think that's a good transition to talking about the games themselves. So we've got so many different recommendations to go through. I put it on a website real quick at sites.google.com/nyu.edu/80sgames, where I'm going to list all of the recommendations we're making and link out to some resources as well. Something we're not talking about is how every single one of these platforms has a completely different emulator, some of which are much easier to use than others. So I wanted to consolidate some of that onto an external reference and consolidate some of the recommendations we had that didn't make it into the talk as well. So yeah, so let's dive into talking about some of these particular platforms and the kind of guided tour of some of the games on them. And so I asked each of you about some particular platforms and what games would be good for somebody in the present to go back and play and experience this platform. So this is a different kind of curated list, right? Like this isn't, these are not the most commercially successful or most influential from these platforms. These wouldn't be on the best of lists necessarily. These are ones that like today you could go and play and would give you a good sense of the platform. That might be slightly different than what was most popular or most successful in the period itself. So I think first up, we've got the Commodore 64, and for each of our platforms, I have an era commercial to kind of set our mood real quick. So let me cue that up. I'm more alive than ever before. To my Commodore 64. My friends are knocking down my door to get into my Commodore 64.
It's mind-boggling. Commodore 64 lets you play hundreds more games with any video machine plus draw program.
Perfect. Great lead in for one of the most successful platforms. So Jesse, you gave us a number of these. So why don't I'll cue them up and you tell us about some of these recommendations that you made. I think first up is Space Taxi.
Yeah, I think Space Taxi is just a really fun, accessible game. It's in the lunar lander kind of gravity. You're a taxi, you're going to fall unless you push the thrusters, inertia. It's crazy taxis, like you're landing, you're picking people up. There's a great little voice, hey, taxi, and then you take them to where you go. And it's just remarkably modern. Like there's 24 different levels. They're very varied. They have different kind of puzzles. You can access them in different, like the easy, medium, and late shift. You can randomize it. Like it really, in a way that games from the early 80s normally do not try to do at all. Is trying to make itself accessible to kind of all skill levels. And yeah, it's just fun.
and then a very different vibe is below the root, your second recommendation.
Yeah, I want to recommend something in the RPG-ish vein, but to stay away from the really heavy kind of grindy stuff. And this is a game actually co-made by Dale Disharoon and Zilpha Keatley-Snyder, and it is a canonical sequel to Snyder's trilogy, the Green Sky trilogy, which is, and I mean this in the best possible way, essentially YA Ursula K. Le Guin. Like that's the vibe. It's very good. I read them last summer because I want to play this game, and you don't need to, though. It's basically an action RPG graphic adventure, a really nice original setting. And because it was kind of a game aimed at kids, one secret is 80s games aimed at kids, at least they thought about the UI and they play tested it in a way that they often did not do for adults. So yeah, this is a fun one that you could play for a few hours and kind of get the feel for it. This is Castles of Dr. Creep, which again, not an all-timer by any means, although a big influence on Prince of Persia. Which I would, if you were to play an 80s version, I guess I'd play the Apple II one. But I think, again, very accessible, does some surprising, like it actually is the first game I've ever seen to tutorialize like every kind of obstacle by putting you in a room. And it's like, this is how the teleporter works. And there's a little sample puzzle that's trivial to solve where you use the teleporter and so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, don't really need the instruction manual. And it has an interesting co-op-y puzzle mode that is fun with two people. And yeah, just a fairly accessible game.
The co-op mode I strongly recommend. It's much harsher and meaner than a modern co-op game, but it's a ton of fun. And I came to this game recently, so it's no nostalgia here. It's just a good time.
And I think this was one of your recommendations, Bennett, as IK Plus.
Yeah, so this is a game by Archer McLean, who cut his teeth on the Atari 8-bit platform. It's a British developer. And I think, so this is IK Plus. International Karate Plus is a sequel to International Karate. I think they got sued by the makers of Karate Champ, Data East. But it's not really anything like Karate Champ. This is a game you play with one joystick and one button. And I think what's significant about it is it's like a one-hit kill fighting game where it's designed for a kind of flowing movement, where you flow from one attack into another by kind of rolling the joystick around the outside. And if you're playing it well, your little guy is just always in motion in a way that is not matched by contemporary fighting games. And so of all of the old 8-bit and 16-bit fighting games, this is the one that is most different in my mind than the kind of Street Fighter template that's overwhelmingly popular now. And you know, I think it still runs well. It's, you know, runs a good enough frame rate and you know, kind of responsive enough that a contemporary player can enjoy it and get good at it.
And you'd also recommended Frankie Goes to Hollywood, which is like a cult classic on the platform. Do you want to tell us about that one as well?
Yeah, this was commissioned by the band Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and it's a kind of a psychedelic game. One of the first, even though it was done under this kind of weird contract work commission situation, you're walking around these houses. This is a good one to play without the manual, because in the first instance you're walking around a village and invading people's houses and rifling through their drawers and stealing their drugs. But once it starts to actually occur to you what the kind of payoff in this game is, it's going to blow your mind. I don't want to ruin it more than that. It is such a trip.
So yeah,
I'll recommend. Yeah.
Yes. I think a favorite of a lot of ours of this platform. So yeah, a quick intro to the Commodore 64. There's many other games on the platform, but as a place to start, I think these are good games for the modern player to check out. Our next system is another very popular and has a huge library is the ZX Spectrum, which I also have it's one of its famous commercials. They recently remade this. Professional keyboard. I like that. That's the top of the.
What's the worst, by the way? Because it was made of rubber. I mean, your tongue would get like sticky.
So they're like, it now has a keyboard. Is the advertisement?
No, that one's terrible.
And yeah, and the Spectrum is an interesting one. It's more console-like than since it was like such a mass market. I think the original was 99 pounds. It was like a more widespread, and the games are smaller and kind of more console-like. So we have a few recommendations. For the first is Alien 8, and this was a recommendation of yours, Bennett.
This is actually a sequel, but it's one of the early games by Ultimate Play the Game, who went on to become a Rare, very famous maker of games like GoldenEye on the N64, Perfect Dark. But when they were breaking through, they were making these isometric 3D games in a way that nobody else had figured out how to do. It's a perfect example of a game that's best to play on the Spectrum. It had slightly faster CPU, which made the 3D work better than it did on systems with better graphical capabilities generally, like the Commodore and the Nintendo. This is the best platform for playing these from that period of time. It's also just what I like about it, I say it's a sequel to a game called Night Law, which was the real revolutionary title. But I like this one better. It's like an open world sort of puzzle game. You have to figure out which order to solve the rooms in, as well as how to solve the rooms. And they're all kind of 3D jumping puzzles. It runs pretty slow by modern tastes. But what you can do is actually speed up the emulator and play it as though the ZX Spectrum was 3 times as fast as it was in reality. And then it approaches the playability of a console title.
And I think we'll get. I think we have Night Lore another recommendations as well. And how about Lords of Midnight?
Mike Singleton was interested in this idea of taking the kind of board game, like the strategic board game scenario, and turning it into kind of first-person views, and sort of blending RPGs and board games in a certain way. This is a game that I think is really interesting and that resonated well with our students when we forced them to play it. If you imagine a game that is like a strategic turn-based game where you're playing a war game with multiple pieces, but you're also playing an RPG where you are those pieces and you're commanding the battlefield from the first-person perspective of the general, and you're giving a bunch of orders, and then your people move by day and the enemies move by night. It's very, very interesting. It's just quite unlike, from a design point of view and from an aesthetic point of view, it's a very, very widescreen sort of like slice of the map that you're looking at all the time. Makes it very, very unlike any game before or since. And I just think it's cool from that point of view. I love how it looks, and it's just very interesting. Yeah,
this is one that I came to in modern times without nostalgia, and is definitely one that once you get over the initial barrier of kind of getting used to the interface, is this totally singular experience. It's very like you're Lord of the Rings, you're the big battle scenes in Return of the King, but also Frodo, and you're like doing both of these things at the same time. So it's really wild. You'd also mentioned one of your recommendations that was like a maybe because it's so weird, but I was like, I obviously have to include.
So this is a game called Deus Ex Machina by Mel Croucher, who was this kind of avant-garde, one of the first sort of avant-garde video game artists. He used to make little games, and they would distribute them by playing the sort of digital signal of the game's data over pirate radios, so people would have to record it, and then so they had experiences like that. this is a game that is a sort of it's like a loose psychedelic exploration of your voyage from being a kind of gay meat in the womb through to old age and death. And you play an audio cassette at the same time as you're playing the game, which has chanting and music. I think it's this one that actually has sort of like National Treasure's British National Treasure actors.
Patrick Troughton is the
Yeah.
thing, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and also who's the actor who played Saruman in Lord of the Rings? I forget.
Specifically, he did the sequel. He was working on the sequel. I don't know if the sequel.
I'm not sure if he's involved in this one, but yeah, he was part of that set as well. So they had this kind of set of intellectual artists who were getting together to really believed that video games could be this kind of like transformative new medium in a way that was very sort of ahead of its time. It doesn't really deliver. It's not a fun thing, but it's kind of it's interesting. But yeah, this is an interesting one to look at. There is a iPhone version of it that was available, so you can have the experience that way.
And how about Saboteur?
Okay, this is a game that I think is approachable. It's by a company called Durrell that was being able to bring like higher frame rate, more console-like experiences out of the Spectrum hardware. You're a ninja. You have to infiltrate a base, recover a disc, plant a bomb, and then escape by helicopter. And so the whole thing is really more of a puzzle than an action game. You have to try to unravel this map and figure out the correct way to approach it, which is a design that used to be overwhelmingly common on these platforms, but is really, really out of vogue now. Like nobody really makes games that way anymore, where the goal is to try to figure out the correct way to play them and then just to do it once. But it also is kind of height of 80s ninja mania, which really had a death grip on the UK, particularly at about the time this game came out. So yeah, it's good from that point of view.
And another Durrell games is Turbo 3.
This is the of all the driving games in history, this is the least like any other driving game. Your left and right buttons just make you change lane. You have to like hit the brakes and go left and right to turn, which you almost never do. But your goal is to sort of memorize the streets of London as you try to hunt down, drug dealers without harming any pedestrians. It's just strange that they were able to get so much fidelity out of such a weak machine. There's 3D buildings, there's people walking around that you can accidentally run over. There's like a whole city map. It's just and I actually think it's pretty fun to play.
And then, Clara, I think this was one of your recommendations, is Head Over Heels, another isometric kind of puzzle adventure.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned Night Lore. I was trying to guess what Bennett would choose. I'm like, there's going to be an ultimate game somewhere. But Head Over Heels is part of that wave. This I like Head Over Heels by Ocean because what it does is first of all, it has a really interesting world. This is one of those games where the manual is setting up the whole world of like, there's like several planets and there's like an evil spider empress that you have to defeat by picking up things in this world. They're kind of like an action adventure kind of genre. And here the protagonist's head and heels are complementary. So you have two characters that have different abilities. One can jump and pick up things, and the other, can run from one place to another. They kind of do the same. One of them can shoot a donut gun. So you're picking up donuts around the place. But it's very interesting because it's basically a 3D puzzler adventure game. It's really complex in only 48K, and it's very charming and kind of like gets you going and gets you thinking about what you have to do next. It's also a large game. I remember seeing in magazines the map for this game. People used to take pictures of each screen and then glue them, and those would go into a magazine, and these were huge, and the map of this game is actually pretty big thanks to tiling, thanks to the way that it was programmed. It was a really expansive world. So yeah, this was it's part of that school of we want to be ultimate as well, but I think it's one of the most most dignified and actually fun rip-offs of what Ultimate was doing.
Yeah, and both of you kind of recommended around it, but I figured we would mention Night Lore as well as being this it's very influential, but still very, very playable. And I think one of the things that I like about it, or that's weird about it, is the sort of simulationist aspect. You see in a lot of British adventure games where there's like, it's not just what we would today identify as adventure game. It also has all these little systemic elements, like the way that you turn into a werewolf at night, and like, and also some fantastic UI. I really love the angled scrolls to account for the perspective of this. It's really nice. All right, so our next system, I have a commercial to cue us up for.
This is the new Apple IIc. This is a computer they call Junior. You might think they're similar, But this one can only run this many programs, while the Apple IIc can run this many.
Pitiful, that junior. And so a good point to that, the Apple IIc, that like the original Apple II is from 1977, but it's like a ecosystem of different successor systems, like the E, the C, there's like all these different ones that are like collectively the Apple II family. And so there's like not necessarily the initial one. And so Naomi, you picked out some Apple II games for us, and the first was Task Times in Tone Town.
Yeah, Pastimes in Tone Town. Maybe the hippest of 80s games in some ways. This is an adventure game. It follows kind of the old model where you have like big icons that represent all of the different verbs that you can do. And the plot, which you can't really see from this screenshot, is that your uncle creates a portal to another world, which is it's basically New Wave the Dimension. Right, so everything in this world is new wave. Everybody has new wave haircuts. There's new wave music playing, and in this world, your dog is a celebrity who can talk. I don't know if I really need to explain anything else about the game.
Perfect. And your next one was Sammy Lightfoot.
This is Sierra Online's attempt to clone Donkey Kong, something that a lot of people have forgotten about. But I like this game a lot more than Donkey Kong because they're trying to one-up Donkey Kong and doing it in a way that I think really anticipates the Massacre games that came decades later. This game is extremely confusing. It's not clear exactly how the physics work or what's going to kill you. You have to figure it out by trial and error. And you play as this guy who's kind of like wearing a Evel Knievel style jumpsuit. I think he's supposed to be a circus performer. And you're trying to get to the platform at the top of the level. And that itself took me a while to figure out like what is even supposed to be going on here. But there's something about the feel of this game, the way the jumping works and the gravity, that's actually quite well done for the time.
How about, this is the Odyssey, the complete adventure, but complete spelled in a sort of grognardy way.
Yeah, Compleat adventure. This is one of the most epic games for the Apple II in the early years. I think this came out in 1980. It's kind of a proto RPG. It's also an expedition game that I think anticipates some of Sid Meier's Pirates in some ways. The idea is that you're assembling a crew of people very slowly over time, and you're exploring this huge island, which is randomly generated, but on the same map. And you're trying to amass wealth and also find all sorts of unusual items. It's not clear what they're for, like monkeys and mirrors. You're just getting all of this stuff. And then halfway through the game, it turns out that what you're doing this for is to buy a ship. And then you get on the ship and suddenly you're in a completely different game where you're sailing around on the ocean. And it has a very detailed sailing simulation. It's also a little bit like Sid Meier's Pirates, right? Where you actually have to think about the wind and all of that. And it turns out that you're on this epic quest to defeat an evil wizard. And it kind of goes on. And it keeps kind of unfolding and origami outwards. Turns out that you need to have that monkey in order to face like a certain challenge in the final level.
Yeah, and that's it's such a good example, I think, of how like genre conventions don't exist yet for most of these games. Yeah. So that like elements that we are like, oh, this is like an RPG and this is like a simulation, this is like an adventure game, that would be weird if they were all mixed together now. Or those conventions don't exist yet. So they have all these kind of disparate elements, and it's
totally mixed together. Like the creator of this game was just like, and you know what else I'm going to put in? A sailing game. And you know what else I'm going to put in? It's a little bit like if one of those AAA games with way too many systems was just made by one person.
Amazing. And you'd also recommended Aztec and Montezuma's Revenge, which are two different but similar games.
Yeah, this one is Aztec, which is the earlier one. I think of this as maybe one of the granddaddies to like all the Tomb Raider games and to games like Spelunky. It's a randomly generated dungeon. Where you have a tall character, right? There's only 3 floors in this because the character is much taller than some of the later, like Spelunky or Montezuma's Revenge. You have like a short little Mario style guy, right? But this game it's unrelentingly difficult. It's quite random. You never know whether there's going to be a snake in that basket or a treasure. There are just a lot of different enemies to defeat, and you're racing against time to try and get to the bottom of this randomly generated tomb and recover the idol and bring it back out. It's a very nicely difficult game. It has terrible feel and terrible controls, but that's like part of the experience. So you're kind of like, you're trying to like see if you can not fall through the staircase and land on the alligator, especially because you can blow up the walls and stairs in this game. It's all destructible, was kind of mind-blowing at the time.
Yeah, I remember like doing the thing where you're trying to crawl so that his hand is just over the edge of a ledge so that you can drop an explosive on an alligator who's 2 floors below me.
Right. And our last Apple II one was Ultima 4, which Ben, this was your recommendation, is one that like especially you need to read the manual. This is the one to like kind of engage with all the extra material.
Yeah, I mean, to Jesse's point about the feelies, this came with a cloth map. It doesn't have to be cloth, of course. You could look at a JPEG. It also came with a book of spells, which you were expected to read and memorize, and a book of monsters, and on top of that, an instruction manual. A lot of this game happens in your head. As you can see, there's not much room for text. There's not even much room for stats and numbers. But it's a game, it's maybe the first game to be interested in asking the player to make moral choices and to set up a kind of RPG style system of morality that is stood as like the most complex moral simulation, morality simulation, well past the BioShock days. It's got some kind of complicated 8 virtue system, and you're expected to try to live up to all of them, even though they conflict. It takes place in a big open world. There is a kind of a thin story, but a rich world to explore. And this game will give you a lot if you put in the effort to play it. Unfortunately, there's no real kind of modernization of this idea. So if you want to experience that kind of like morality simulation, like I'm saying, this is the game to go to.
That's the end of our Apple II. Our next platform is the Amiga, which I have a great little commercial for.
I am the Commodore Amiga 500 home computer. Dazzling animation at your command. I am the Commodore Amiga 500, a multitasking home office in your hand. I am the Commodore Amiga 500, total home video you control, and arcade quality games in stereo. And now, you can be everything I am.
Oddly intimidating commercial, I find, but a good signal. This is sort of a different period of time than this is a 16-bit computer, not an 8-bit. So it's like the kind of next generation. So a little bit more, I think, more accessible graphics at least to modern players. And so Ben, many of these are your recommendations. So we can just jump into these. I think your first was Cannon Fodder.
This is a British game. So, I mean, it's worth just touching briefly. You saw them advertising that as a business machine. The American company making the Amiga was like desperately keen not to be seen as making a gaming machine because of the Atari crash. They didn't want to lose all their investors, people who were worried about games at the time. But in Europe, of course, there were no consoles. So it was treated just as a gaming machine. So most of the important games, not all, but most of the important Amiga games come out of Europe. This is British. It's a satirical real-time war game. It's like squad-based combat. You control up to 5 or 6 little guys with the mouse, and it's very arcadey. It sort of controls a lot like League of Legends or something like that. You click to move them around. You right-click to shoot, and you have to kind of like tactically, I guess, break down these maps and kill all the enemies and complete the missions. But it has overlaid on it this kind of war is hell type thing, where all of your guys who die, they don't come back, and you have to see a memorial for them, and you see their gravestones every time you start a mission. And like you're trying to keep them alive, just like in Fire Emblem or something like that. They get upgraded over time. It's just it's fun, it's playable, it stands up. This is a good one.
And then Paradroid, or this is Paradroid 90, the Amiga version. Both you and Jesse did a podcast with Kanan
Rinse. Yeah.
Rinse. I was going to say Kanan Lynch, and I was like, no, that's a different thing. That's a different podcast. The Kanan Rinse podcast talking about there's a Commodore 64 version of this and an Amiga version, and it was in both of your recommendations. And so yeah, tell us a bit about Paradroid.
The Amiga version is much more playable, but it's not the original. I think to a modern audience, much more accessible. You're this little droid that is a paradroid in that it can't do anything, but it can take over other robots. And your job is to kill, I don't know why, but to kill every single robot on this giant spaceship. And you have to, the tactics of it is like, maybe I can more easily take over a weak service droid that carries cups on its head, but it doesn't have a very good gun, if any gun. So maybe I'll use that to get the Sentinel droid. So like a lot of these computer games from the 80s and 90s, it's sort of because they couldn't pull off the highest frame rates and the best game feel, they tend to have more of a kind of a puzzle action characteristic to them. You're trying to solve the levels, a bit more like Hotline Miami or something like that, and less like just enjoying this kind of moment-to-moment combat like you would in a Japanese or American action game. So yeah, this is like perfect example of one of those.
And Speedball 2, this is one of my favorites of the system.
This is a future sports game. We still have people still making these now in the Steam and console era. But it's European handball played by people wearing armor, beating each other up. what I think is interesting about this game, apart from the fact it is just actually a fun, high frame rate, well-tuned action game. You can play 2 players is the best way to play it. It's a really great example of what I love about the Amiga, which is that it had this pixel art styles that fed through the Scandinavian demo scene and American graffiti art styles to produce this really kind of particular approach to color and shading. And I think it's really interesting, and it's something that people can and should, and maybe already do, borrow quite heavily from in modern indie games. This particular game is a prime example of how an Amiga game looks in my head.
And how about It Came from the Desert? This is one of my favorites.
This is what we thought interactive movies were going to be. We thought that, so this is a company called CinemaWare, an American company that was concerned with trying to make interactive movies. They're trying to make a B movie about giant ants that get mutated by a radioactive rock. It's like the way that they do it is that it's sort of a visual novel interspersed with action sequences that capture different things, like an ant attack, flying a plane, driving a car, having a knife fight at the drive-in. And they're trying to give you just a little taste of everything to get enough of a sense of time and place. It's really interesting, and it plays pretty well.
And as a result, it was kind of hard to get a good representative screenshot for a number of these games because all these different modes are so different. There's
it's not an FPS, but sometimes an ant will attack and you have to try to shoot it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then our 2 last ones, you recommended Syndicate as well.
Syndicate is another squad-based tactics game. It's sort of Blade Runner sort of style. It's that isometric 3D that we were looking at from the 8-bit machines. This is Peter Molyneux's magnum opus, I guess. I really love this game. Every mission is a little bit different. Maybe you have to kind of capture a diplomat who's about to be limoed to a destination. And, it's just a very complicated simulation, but still plays really well.
This is one that a friend had when I was in school, and I was obsessed with going to their house to see the next mission for. And then 2 last ones, Clara. This was one of yours, is Captain Blood, which is on a variety of systems, but I think the Amiga and Atari ST are sort of the home ones. Do you want to give us a little information about this one?
So Captain Blood is a French game, and I always say that it's very French. The music was composed by Jean-Michel Jarre, which was all the rage at the end of the 80s, and with this synthesizer music. But the interesting thing is that it's a game where you're exploring space. The galaxy is procedurally generated, so you don't play the same game twice. And you're looking for your homes. You have to land into planets and talk to aliens and learn their language, and that's one of the most interesting things. You talk to the alien, you try to figure out what those symbols on the screen mean, and you learn how to communicate with them so they give the information.
This is one that I'm always recommending to students. It's like a weird, interesting system, and it's like off-putting but like fun and bizarre. It's an excellent one. Right. All right, and our next platform, I believe, is the MSX, and I have a region-appropriate commercial for us.
Para algunos, un ordenador familiar es así, o así, o así. Para Sony, un ordenador familiar es así, sencillo, práctico y útil, para ordenar, estudiar, trabajar, jugar y para aprender juntos toda la familia. Los ordenadores Hitbit son compatibles MSX y pueden crecer. Es un Sony.
This was an international platform, so there were commercials for this in every region that it released. So I grabbed one from Spain, or according to YouTube.
I didn't remember this ad, but I guess that's what was the ad that we were showing when I was a kid. Yeah. Well, the MSX was less a computer, more a computer standard. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of advancing the way that we have kind of like standards that different manufacturers can use. So Sony was making MSX computers, Toshiba was in Japan, but Philips and Pioneer in Europe were also making. Pioneer is European or Japanese, I don't know. But there were also European manufacturers making it. Like they were a bit all over the place, and they were following these standards, the same standard.
And so I think it's a really interesting one for modern American players, since unlike a lot of the systems we've seen that originated in America, even if they maybe had a bit bigger sales overseas, the MSX is one of the few computers that's like almost no American footprint. There are a few, I think there are a couple of developers, but it's mostly Europe and Asia where games are being made for this. So your first recommendation is a classic.
So most of the games that I'm recommending are Konami, because they are the ones that have withstood the passage of time, and some of them are versions of games that people might be familiar with already. But they were really different from the MSX.
Mm.
And the first one is, of course, I had to talk about Metal Gear. There's no Solid, just Metal Gear, 1987 for the MSX2. Yes, this is Kojima's first game as a lead that he actually inherited from somebody else. And what is interesting is that, first of all, if you've played the NES version, that's not the original. This is it. The story premise, is all there. But what is interesting, Kojima has talked about this, that it was the technical limitations of the MSX2 that led to the tactical espionage action, because they couldn't have a lot of enemies moving, they couldn't have a lot of bullets on the screen. So it was a game where it was better to just be stealthy and not be caught, because then it could not run. So that kind of like trying to adapt around the limitations of the platform is what created this stealth genre that now we all play. There was a sequel, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, that was only released for the MSX. It hasn't had any ports as far as I know. And then if you think about the Metal Gear Solid series, it was solid because it was going to be Metal Gear 3, like cube, like a solid. So that's what the title comes from. But yes, like this is the origins of it, and it comes from the specific limitations of the MSX2.
And you also recommended another Kojima game.
Well, this is not, so this is Antarctic Adventure, which was from '83, is one of the early Konami games for the MSX. And this is basically a reskinned racing game. So instead of a car, you have a penguin. And instead of having other cars, you have to dodge seals and cracks on the ice. And you have to go from A to B within a specific amount of time. You're going to visit all the international stations in Antarctica, and that's the game. The interesting part was the sequel, Penguin Adventure, which was Kojima's first game as an assistant. And that adds up a bunch of new mechanics. There are merchants, and you can buy items that can speed you up. You can fly over, the seals, and you can, like avoid obstacles. You can also get a gun for the penguin to kill enemies, apparently. And you're also fighting dinosaurs. So that's kind of, and the premise is that you have to find this golden apple to rescue, to heal the prince's penguin. So it becomes like very weird. It also has an impossible ending where like you can only win if you pause a game once, not twice, no, never. And it's kind of part of that weirdness. But it's a game that's still very playable. But both of them are still, really fun and really engaging.
And you also recommended Vampire Killer, which is one. There's a lot of confusion around some of the Konami games that are on MSX and on Nintendo, because it's Castlevania, but it is also not at all Castlevania.
Exactly. Yeah. So Vampire Killer, one day I'll learn enough Japanese to try to justify that this is the original game, although it's probably not. There was the arcade version, and this was developed in parallel to Castlevania. It was what we could call now a launch title for the MSX2. It was released around the same time as the first MSX2 machines were available. And one thing that is different is that while the Castlevania for NES has scrolling levels, this has an open world. There's platforming, but the levels are really large. It's similar to Symphony of the Night, for example. That thing that now we associate with the Metroidvania, it was doing it early on, before even Castlevania figured it out. The only thing is that because of, again, technical limitations, you can only see one screen at a time of the large space. But that was one of the sign differences. The other is that it has some RPG elements, and that you can also find merchants. Konami had this space where merchants were in all the games, and you can buy items apart from finding them in the environment. But it was advancing things that you would see in later Castlevania games in '86.
And you also recommend a shoot 'em up, the first kind of explicitly arcade genre we've seen so far.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this was an exclusive title for MSX2, as far as I remember. There might have been other ports, but shooters were not great in the MSX precisely because of frame rate, precisely because you could not have as many sprites on screen as one would expect with a shooter game. This one is usually acknowledged. This is not a Konami game, by the way. The company was called Compile. And what is cool is that you start the game and there are these cutscenes that are like anime cutscenes. And it's, for the time, really, really spectacular. You have, a protagonist, and you're like kicking ass, fighting aliens. And it's also like, it's very smooth. This was towards the end of the life of the MSX2, like as a kind of like blooming platform. As Jesse was saying before, this was when people have figured out how to make the best out of the MSX2 graphics and how to do this. So it still plays really well. It's like really smooth and really, really cool.
And lastly, you recommended The Maze of Galliolus, which is a rare, it's a very influential one.
Yes, this is a sequel to a game called Nightmare with a K. That was also a thing in the 80s. This is a kind of open platform, had a huge map, kind of like Castlevania as well. And this also had, two protagonists who had different items, and they had access to the maze from different places. And it was really complex because it was platforming, it was RPG elements, finding out items, using items in a specific way. Each character could not use the same items. There were things that one character was better at than the other. And it's been very influential in games like La Mulana, which was playing a direct homage to the Maze of Gallius.
Yeah, I think of it as it's a like Metroidvania sort of mold. This kind of like map you're exploring and backtracking and collecting items and very accessible to play today. I think it's really a lot of fun.
And full of secrets, right? There is a kind of aesthetics of secrets in games of this era that does not exist now in the YouTube era, where everything is spoiled. So I think it's always interesting for people now to play games which are just packed full of like secrets, or like even entire other games hidden within games. Something we used to love in the 80s that has almost died away completely.
And Ben, you had an MSX recommendation as well, which was Penguin Coon Wars.
Yeah.
This is one I've just found.
Sorry, the one that I left out of my list. You chose it.
So this game, it's like it's just two-player dodgeball, I guess, is really the design. You're trying to throw balls past the other person or hit them to stun them. But it's really just, it's fun in a way that makes it more accessible than nearly everything else on the MSX. And I find that when people get given this game to play, even contemporary players who didn't grow up with this kind of thing, they tend to love it. So yeah, definitely worth a play.
Okay, so then, so we'll take a look at the original Macintosh. And I have my short ad for.
Introducing Macintosh. It does all the things you'd expect a business computer to do. It does a lot of things you wouldn't expect a business computer to do. And it does some things no other business computer has
Goes
ever
on
done
for a while
before.
talking about all of its great business capabilities. But yeah, we're talking about the games on it. This is like a sort of like a lost history, the early games on the Macintosh, and like a lot of really great examples on this game and on the system, and so visually distinctive as well. Just you'd made the point about this like 1-bit kind of art style. It's just it's like there's a resurgence and interest in, and so it's worth taking a look at. Both Jesse and Ben, you'd recommended the Fool's Errand. This is just like a classic. Did either of you want to tell us about this?
It's just incredibly good. Like, you can play it today and it's just as good as it was, and it really uses every possible part of the game. Like, it is made by an artist. It is made by a person who does puppets and animation and like just a polymath, and who knows nothing about computer games and just puts all of their energy into making this like very perfect game where every aspect of it matters. And often you get stuck in a puzzle because you're like, well, that can't matter, and it does, and then you solve it.
I think it's really
it's
what we think of. Sorry, it's what we think of as an indie game. I think really importantly, and it's an indie game because he spent 25 years working on the sequel.
True.
You can only get it by paying the guy directly. There's no platform.
Ben, you'd also recommended Dark Castles when you've talked a lot about before.
This is the Macintosh's answer to Prince of Persia. It's, as far as I know, the first WASD and mouse game. So you aim the guy's throwing arm and throw rocks with the mouse, and you make him move around and run using WASD and space. It has action feel unlike any other game now in a way that contemporary students find almost impossible to deal with. But it's a beautiful game and just aesthetically has just a huge amount of style.
Yeah, it's one in the NYU Game Center library where we have a vintage Macintosh. Playing this on the original hardware, the art is like really astoundingly good. I'm sure this will how this gets compressed will mush together a lot of pixels, but it's really beautiful. And you also recommend Deja Vu. This is like a Mac venture, I think, is part of that series.
Yeah, so this series of Mac venture games had the idea, well, they've given us this nice API for making windows and dragging icons around, and like what if every part of the game is an icon that can be dragged by the mouse? And so your inventory is a window full of like little draggable icons that you can drag around inside of like containers and stuff, and then moving around you do from another little sub window, and that just gives it a very strange feel. It's like a noir detective story. You wake up not having any idea who you are, and you're trying to sort of unravel a mystery. still playable now. I knew about this game in the 80s, but only played it a couple of years ago, and I played it through, and it stands up super well.
Mm. And Jesse, you'd recommended Inigo Gets Out. This is like a relatively deep cut, I think.
I mean, it was very influential because it was talked up by game designers and a big influence on Loom, right, which is a LucasArts game that had a very minimal UI by Brian Moriarty. And yeah, it's a hypercard game, right? It is an early hypercard. You can play it in about 3 minutes. It's very charming. You follow a little cat around and you click on things. And but yeah, I mean, it's sort of here to stand in for checking out HyperCard in general, which was, you know, this very accessible, very flexible kind of system for people making their own games and database stacks and other, you know, pre-World Wide Webby kind of stuff. And yeah, there's Amanda Goodenough made several sequels to it. You can find those as well. They're all very, very charming. And yeah, certainly the most accessible games we've covered probably because you click on the cat and it does the thing.
Yeah, and the HyperCard, I feel like there's been increasing interest in recently in preserving them and stuff like that. And yeah, so imaginative. The Manhole is the other great one by Random Robin Miller. Is like I was really surprised at just how like interesting and fun it is. Out of just pictures that have hotspots that you click on that lead to the pictures, like that's the only mechanic, but they get so much mileage out of it. And you'd also recommended Shufflepuck Cafe. This one is on a lot of other platforms, but the Macintosh one's like I think the original and best.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that distinguishes the Mac from all the other computers we've talked about is there's no joystick, right? I never have seen a joystick attached to a Mac. And so if you want to play action games, they'd either be keyboard and mouse like Dark Castle or just mouse, right? In Shufflepuck Cafe, it very much feels like a game designed to teach you how to use a mouse. You know, like it is about, in the same way that Breakout is about a paddle or Marble Madness is about a trackball, Shufflepuck is the pure mimesis of like, I move the mouse and the puck moves, and if I move the mouse fast, I hit the puck fast. It also has the animations are very charming. You face different aliens that each have different quirks. And I think the guy's name was Gene Portwood. He also worked on Carmen Sandiego. This is a Broderbund game. And he had a career like as a Disney animator in the 60s and 70s. And so, yeah, there's a very clear charm that comes through. The Amiga version is also good, but I think the Mac is probably the one to play.
Yeah, I think it's this opponent who starts out with like the best AI, but as he gets drunk, he gets really.
Every time he makes a shot, he
gets worse. Such a good mechanic. And you also were going to Hidden Agenda is one of my favorites as well.
Yeah, I think this is probably in the 80s class. I have students, you know, they write critical play reports every week. And I think this is the #1 game, honestly, in terms of just best reviewed, most consistently. Everyone who plays it really likes it and writes something interesting about it. And yeah, it's a fascinating game where you are the newly elected Democratic president of Chimerica, a fictional Central American country in the 80s. And it's kind of a mix of choose your adventure and sim. I mean, there's numbers in their systems, but you're talking to people and choosing. You have a bunch of advisors. You choose things based on that, and it really just does like you feel screwed from every direction. In a sense, like when you are playing this game, it really just gives you the sense of like there is no good answers to any of the stuff that I'm confronting, and how you deal with it, and also the idea that your advisors, you may tell them to do something, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do that thing because they may have a hidden agenda. And so certainly, as compared to most sim games, which are much more solipsistic power fantasies, in the sense of just like I control the city and I set this and I zone that and the things happen. This is actually in a lot of ways, even though it is rougher because it is more of a choose your own adventure-y kind of structure almost. But yeah, a really compelling game, really well researched, really interesting. And yeah, definitely you can play it on DOS, but the graphics look way better. They're mostly like still photos of people and stuff like that, and they just look way better on the Mac.
And you also recommended Chris Crawford's Balance of Power.
Yeah, I mean, as Crawford games go, I might even say Ciboot, but this does feel like the one to check out. And it also has an entire book he wrote about the underpinnings and assumptions behind the systems. So if you're kind of interested in looking at these from a more academic or like kind of diving into it, like this is an incredibly rich text. And it's essentially, yeah, very much a game designed around the Mac UI, the drag and drop windows. It was kind of a big hit. It got a very intellectual New York Times article about it as, you know, a game for adults. And it's not the most exciting thing in the world because you are just kind of looking at a lot of charts and like kind of sussing things out. But it is a game where you're either the US or the USSR. You're trying to basically maintain your prestige without going through DEFCON 1 and nuclear war, in which case it gives you a screen where Chris Crawford chastises you and says, you're not going to get a fun graphic of people blowing up because you failed.
Yeah, it's a really
very interesting
one in that it looks like a war strategy game. Like it has the maps, it has all the the things that you associate with a war strategy game. But like war is the lose state in this. It's like a diplomacy.
Well, I mean, it's a war game. It's just a soft war game,
right?
So there's insurgencies and foreign military aid and threats and brinksmanship. But the nukes make a difference.
Yeah. All right. Well, and that brings us to the end of our whirlwind tour of a couple of different systems. So like I mentioned, I've got a website where I put on all of our recommendations, so it would be easier to access there. But yeah, I think so like a great kind of place to start for a lot of these different systems and seeing kind of these game design strains that are not around today. So yeah, thank you all so much for your time and your recommendations. Yeah, thanks so much for your time. I guess we'll see you later. It's weird because we're pre-recording this, so it feels like but we'll see you all later.
Bye.
Bye everybody.